The wind in Montana doesn't just blow, it howls, it screams. It claws at you with invisible talons sharp enough to peel the skin from your bones. And on that particular afternoon, it felt like the devil himself was chasing it, spitting snowflakes like shards of broken glass. Eleanor Hayes felt that devil's breath on the back of her neck. She pressed herself against the rough bark of a cottonwood, her thin shawl doing about as much good as a paper napkin in a hurricane. The cold wasn't just around her, it was inside her, a parasite eating away at what little warmth she had left. Her fingers, already numb inside patched gloves, fumbled with the clasp of an old carpet bag. Inside was everything she owned in the world, 25 years old, and utterly, terrifyingly alone. Just 3 days ago, she'd been Miss Hayes, the school teacher, respected. She had a small room above the bakery, the smell of fresh bread waking her every morning. It wasn't much, but it was a life, a foundation. Then the school board had called a meeting. Grim faces, shifting eyes. Budget's been cut, old Mr. Peterson had mumbled. Can't afford a teacher through the winter. And just like that, the foundation turned to dust. The job was gone. The room was gone. Mrs. Kowalski, the baker's wife, needed the space for paying tenants. Her sympathy was as thin as Eleanor's shawl. So here she was, with $3 silver clinking in her pocket like a funeral bell. Not enough for a ticket east, not that she had anywhere to go. The family farm in Ohio, sold for debt. Her intended herald. He'd made it quite clear that a penniless schoolteacher was no longer suitable for a man of his rising stature. The wind picked up, and she tasted snow. Not the gentle kind. This was killer snow, the kind that buried travelers who weren't careful, leaving them frozen solid as fence posts for someone to find come spring. The thought made her stomach clench with a fear that was colder than the wind. She was going to die out here. It wasn't a possibility. It was a certainty, creeping closer with every gust of wind. But then, through the swirling white, she saw them. Iron gates. They were stark and black against the snow. The entrance to the Caldwell Ranch. Everyone in the little town of Bitter Creek knew about Thomas Caldwell. They spoke his name in whispers. Biggest spread in 3 counties. Cattle by the thousand. A house so fine it could have been plucked from a city back east. But they also whispered other things. Darker things. They said his wife, Margaret, had died birthing their second son. A tragedy, of course, but the whispers didn't stop there. Some said the official story was too simple, too clean. They said Thomas Caldwell had a temper as fierce and unpredictable as a Montana blizzard. They said his eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. He was raising 2 boys on his own, and the church ladies tisked about it constantly. It ain't proper, they'd say, for a man to raise babies alone. But none of them ever volunteered to help. They were too afraid of him. Eleanor wasn't sure what made her feet move toward those gates. Maybe it was just the animal instinct for survival kicking in. Freezing to death under a tree was a poor end to a story, and any port in a storm, right? Even a port with a fearsome reputation. The snow was coming down hard now, a blinding curtain of white. She could barely see 10 feet ahead, and that's when she noticed something strange. The gate was open. A massive, prosperous ranch like this, with rustlers being a constant threat. Leaving the main gate wide open in a blizzard made no sense. It was an invitation, or a trap. She walked up the long drive, her boots crunching in the fast-deepening snow, without quite making the decision to do so. It was like her body had taken over, dragging her toward the one tiny flicker of hope in this frozen wasteland. The house appeared out of the storm like a ghost ship, 2 stories of solid timber, with warm yellow light spilling from the windows. Smoke curled from the chimney, a promise of warmth, of life. It was everything she'd lost, everything she'd never had, all wrapped up in one impossible, terrifying package. She was still just standing there, a statue of desperation, when the front door swung open. And there he was, Thomas Caldwell. He filled the doorway, a silhouette of a man who looked as solid and unyielding as the mountains behind him. Even from 30 feet away, she could see the surprise on his face. He stepped out onto the porch, not even bothering with a coat. "You lost, miss?" His voice wasn't a shout, but it cut through the wind's howl, deep and steady as bedrock. What could she possibly say? The truth? I'm not lost. I'm destitute. I have nowhere to go, and I'm about to freeze to death. It sounded too much like begging. Because it was. The storm, she called back, her voice thin and reedy. It came up sudden. He just stood there studying her. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing. Not her threadbare coat, not the desperate way she clutched her bag, not the fact that she was half frozen and on the verge of collapse. He stepped down from the porch, his boots making deep prints in the snow as he walked toward her. He didn't stop until he was just a few feet away. "You're the school teacher," he said. It wasn't a question. "Was," she corrected, lifting her chin, fighting the tremor in her voice. The position was eliminated. He nodded slowly, as if this was old news. "Figured as much. Saw you walking up the drive with everything you own in that bag." The casual observation was like a slap. Was she that obvious? That pathetic? "Storm's getting worse," he said, glancing at the sky. "Be a full-blown blizzard before long. You got somewhere to be?" The simple question hit her like a punch to the gut. Somewhere to be, if only. "Not particularly," she managed. They stood there in the swirling snow, two strangers in a world of white. She could see something working behind those winter blue eyes, some calculation she couldn't begin to understand. It felt like he was weighing her, measuring her worth. And then he spoke, and the words he said were so unexpected, so utterly bizarre, that she thought the cold must be making her hear things. "I've got coffee on the stove," he said. "House is warm. Storm like this, a person could freeze before making it back to town." It was an offer of shelter, a simple act of kindness. But then he added something else, his voice dropping, his eyes locking onto hers with an unnerving intensity. "But I have a proposition for you, a way for you to stay, permanently." What in God's name did he mean by that? This wasn't just an offer of shelter from a storm. This was something else entirely. And Eleanor had a sinking feeling that the blizzard outside was nothing compared to the storm she was about to walk into. The warmth that hit her when she stepped inside was like a physical blow. It was salvation. The entryway was bigger than her entire room at the bakery, all polished wood and high ceilings. But it was stark, clean, yes, but empty. There was no woman's touch anywhere. No flowers, no embroidered cushions, no softness. It was a beautiful house, but it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a barracks with nice furniture. "Boys," Thomas called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Come meet our guest." The sound of running feet, and then two small faces peeked around a corner. One was about 7 or 8, with his father's serious eyes and strong jaw. The other, maybe 5, had a cloud of unruly hair and a curious, open face. "This is Miss Hayes," Thomas said. "She's going to wait out the storm with us." The older boy, Daniel, just stared at her with open suspicion, but the younger one, Samuel, stepped forward. "Are you really a teacher?" he asked, his eyes wide. "I was," Eleanor said, crouching down to his level. "Do you like learning things?" "Papa says I have to learn my letters, but they're hard." "They are hard at first," she agreed, "but once you know them, they open up whole worlds." Daniel didn't move. He just watched her, his expression guarded, almost hostile. It was more than just shyness. It was something else, something that made the hairs on Eleanor's arms stand up. Thomas led her to the kitchen. It was enormous, dominated by a massive cook stove, but like the rest of the house, it felt unused, functional, but without a soul. He poured her a cup of coffee from a dented old pot. It was black as midnight and strong enough to strip paint. She wrapped her frozen fingers around the tin cup, letting the warmth seep into her bones. "Roads will be impassable by morning," Thomas said, staring out the window at the thick, swirling snow. Eleanor stared into her cup. She had to say something, but what? She couldn't just ask to stay the night. It wasn't proper. And besides, his earlier words still echoed in her mind. A way for you to stay, permanently. What did he mean? "I heard about the school," he said, breaking the silence. "Shame. Children need learning. Not enough to pay for it, apparently." "What'll you do now?" There it was. The question she'd been dreading, the one that laid her situation bare. I, I'm not sure, she stammered. Look for another position, I suppose. Where? He asked. And that one simple word destroyed what little composure she had left. There was no where. He was quiet for a long, heavy moment. The only sounds were the wind howling outside and the faint laughter of one of the boys from another room. And then he spoke. I told you I had a proposition, he said. His voice had changed. It was low, serious, the voice of a man about to sign a contract. Eleanor looked up, her heart starting to pound. I need a wife. She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. The steam from her coffee swirled between them. I beg your pardon? Not for romance, he continued, his voice flat, emotionless, as if he were discussing the price of cattle. This would be a business arrangement. You need shelter, security. I need someone to keep house and help with the boys. Winter's coming on hard and I can't manage it all alone anymore. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This couldn't be happening. Men didn't just propose marriage to strangers, they found freezing in their driveway. Especially not a man like Thomas Caldwell, a man the whole town was afraid of. Mr. Caldwell, I hardly know you. What's to know? He said, his gaze unwavering. I'm a decent man. I don't drink to excess. I don't raise my hand to women or children. I own this land free and clear. You'd want for nothing. He paused, and his next words were like a gut punch. The boys need a mother. He made it sound so simple, so logical, but it wasn't. There was a dark undercurrent here she couldn't grasp. Why her, a penniless stranger? Why so fast? It felt desperate, and his desperation was somehow more frightening than the storm outside. It wouldn't be a real marriage, he added quickly as if sensing her thoughts. Separate rooms, separate lives in many ways. Just two people helping each other survive. She looked around the cold, empty kitchen. She thought of those two little boys, growing up without a woman's touch. She thought of herself, with $3 silver and a blizzard raging outside. Survival. That's what it came down to. Why me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than cold calculation in his eyes. It looked like fear. Because you're educated, he said, and because you're alone. You have no one to ask questions, no family to come looking for you. He paused, letting the terrifying implication of that statement hang in the air. And because you're desperate enough to say yes. The brutal honesty of it stole her breath. He wasn't just offering her a home. He was offering her a cage. A beautiful, warm cage, but a cage nonetheless. She was trapped. By the storm, by her poverty, and now by this terrifying proposal. He showed her to a small, Spartan room on the first floor. It was probably meant for a housekeeper. The bed was narrow, the furniture plain, but it was clean and warm. As she sat on the edge of the mattress, listening to the storm rage outside, his words echoed in her head. No family to come looking for you. Was that a condition of the agreement, or was it a threat? She tried to imagine this life, waking up every day to cook and clean for a man who was a complete stranger, a man whose own neighbors whispered about him, a man whose oldest son looked at her with something bordering on hatred, raising children who might never accept her, living as a ghost in a house that was haunted by the memory of another woman. Margaret, the wife who had died here. But then she thought of the alternative, the endless cold, the gnawing hunger, the certainty of freezing to death alone in the dark. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had no choice. She knew it. He knew it. The only question was what secrets this house held. What really happened to the first Mrs. Caldwell? The morning was unnervingly quiet. The world outside was buried under 2 feet of pristine, unforgiving snow. The silence was absolute, the kind that only follows a monster storm. When Eleanor emerged from her room, the smell of coffee and bacon met her. Thomas was standing at the kitchen window, a dark silhouette against the blinding white landscape. Storm's blown itself out, he said without turning. Roads will be impassable for days. Days. The word hung in the air. She was his prisoner, courtesy of the weather. He finally turned to face her, and the question was there in his eyes. She didn't need him to ask it. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "about your arrangement." He just nodded, his face giving nothing away. This man was a fortress. "I need to understand what you're really asking," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You say the boys need a mother. What does that mean? What would you expect from me?" He leaned against the counter, taking his time, as if choosing his words from a very limited supply. "Consistency," he said finally. "Proper meals, clean clothes, manners, help with their letters. They've been without a woman's guidance for 2 years. They're running wild. And you, what would you expect? From a wife?" The word felt alien on her tongue. "Someone to manage the household," he said, his voice a low, matter-of-fact rumble. "Someone I can depend on. Someone who won't run off at the first sign of hardship." That last part, the way he said it, it wasn't just a general statement. It was pointed, specific. Had his first wife tried to leave him? Was that the secret the town whispered about? "And in return," she pressed, "security, a roof over your head, my name, and the protection that comes with it. You would be mistress of this house. The boys would be yours to raise." He laid it all out like a legal contract. No emotion, no warmth, just terms and conditions. It was chilling. "Separate rooms," she said, making it a statement, not a question. "Separate rooms," he confirmed. He paused, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Unless someday we decided different, but that would be your choice as much as mine." The implication, the possibility of more sent a jolt of alarm through her. This was getting more complicated, more dangerous by the second. Just then, the sound of small feet on the stairs broke the tension. Samuel appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Papa, is the lady still here?" he asked. "Miss Hayes is still here," Thomas confirmed. "Say good morning." "Good morning, Miss Hayes," the boy mumbled shyly. Then his eyes lit up. "Did you see all the snow? Papa says we're snowed in for days. Will you stay that long?" The innocent question was like a trap snapping shut. Eleanor could feel Thomas's eyes on her, waiting. She looked from Samuel's hopeful face to Daniel, who had appeared behind him, his expression still wary, suspicious, listening to every word. This wasn't just a decision for her anymore. It was about these two motherless boys. "I might," she said carefully, "if your father doesn't mind." "Can you really teach us letters?" Samuel asked, practically vibrating with excitement. "Daniel says they're stupid, but I think they're like secret codes." "They are very much like secret codes," Eleanor found herself smiling. "Once you learn them, you can unlock anything." She glanced at Daniel, who was trying to look bored but failing. She saw a flicker of interest, a tiny crack in his armor. "Boys, go get dressed," Thomas ordered. "Miss Hayes and I need to finish talking." When they were alone again, the silence was heavy. "They like you," he stated. "Samuel does. Daniel is reserving judgment." "Daniel's old enough to remember his mother," Thomas said, his voice hardening slightly. "He's protective." "Protective of what? Or of whom?" Eleanor took a deep breath. It was time to ask the hard question. "Mr. Caldwell, what happens if this arrangement doesn't work? If we find we can't manage together?" He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the endless snow. "I'm not a man who gives up easy," he said, his voice low and grim. "And I don't think you are either. We'd make it work." It wasn't an answer. It was a command. There was no escape clause in this contract. She thought about the whispers in town, the fear in people's eyes when they said his name. She thought about his dead wife. Was this a marriage proposal or a life sentence? "The town will talk," she said, one last attempt at finding a way out. "Let them talk," he said, his voice like stone. "The question is, do you have a better offer?" And of course she didn't. He had her, cornered by the storm, by poverty, by the simple, brutal fact that he was her only option. But she couldn't just surrender. She had to have something for herself. one piece of her old life. I'd want to continue teaching, she said, the words coming out in a rush. The boys, yes, but others too. If any families wanted lessons, I could set up a schoolroom. Here. She expected him to refuse. Most men would never allow their wife to work, to have a life outside the home. But he just nodded. The house is big enough, he said, his casual acceptance more unnerving than an argument would have been. Might be good for the boys, to have other children around. He was agreeing too easily. It felt like he was luring her in, making it all seem perfect. Too perfect. But what choice did she have? A life of servitude in a beautiful house with a mysterious, possibly dangerous man, or a quick, cold death in the snow? Miss Hayes? It was Samuel's voice from the stairs. Can you help me with my buttons? Eleanor looked at Thomas. He just nodded. An order. Go. Be a mother. She went. As she fumbled with the boy's small shirt buttons, he chattered away, a stream of innocent questions. Do you know any songs? Can you bake cookies? Daniel appeared moments later, his hair a mess. Eleanor, acting on instinct, pulled a comb from her pocket and started to fix it. He flinched at her touch, but he didn't pull away. She saw something in his eyes then. Not just suspicion, fear. This boy was terrified, but not of her, of his father. Later, after the boys were fed, she found herself alone with Thomas again. The unspoken question hung between them, thick and heavy as the snowdrifts outside. You haven't given me an answer, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. She looked at him, this powerful, enigmatic man who held her life in his hands. She thought of the fear in Daniel's eyes. These boys needed someone to stand between them and whatever darkness lived in this house. Maybe that was her purpose, not just to survive, but to protect them. If I say yes, she said, her voice quiet but firm, it will be for them, and you will let me set up my school, unhindered. Agreed, he said instantly. She took a deep breath. Then yes, Mr. Caldwell, I'll marry you. He didn't smile. He didn't show an ounce of relief or happiness. He just nodded, as if they'd just settled on a price for a bull. I'll ride for the preacher as soon as the road's clear. He extended his hand. She took it. His grip was like iron. Welcome to the family, Miss Hayes, he said. From the next room, there was a sudden crash, followed by Samuel crying out, Papa, Daniel hit me. Thomas sighed, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he smoothed it back into a mask of indifference. He turned and walked toward the sound of the crying child. Eleanor followed, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She'd just agreed to marry a man she didn't know, to become a mother to 2 children, one of whom was terrified of him. She had a roof over her head, yes, but she hadn't escaped the storm. She'd just walked into the eye of it. 3 days later, the roads were clear enough for a horse, and Thomas was true to his word. He rode to town and returned not with the preacher, but with news. The preacher, Reverend Morrison, would be there in 2 days. 2 days until her life was no longer her own. The boys reacted to the news in starkly different ways. Samuel was ecstatic. He followed Eleanor around constantly, peppering her with questions. Will you be our real mama? Will you live here forever? Will you teach me to write my name? His innocent joy was a sharp, painful contrast to the cold dread that was slowly colonizing Eleanor's heart. Daniel, on the other hand, became even more withdrawn. He watched her with his father's unnerving, calculating eyes. He was silent, observant, and his silence was louder than any protest. He would sit in a corner of the room while she read to Samuel, never joining in, just watching, judging. It was as if he was waiting for her to make a mistake, or waiting for her to disappear, just like his mother had. Eleanor tried to break through his shell. Daniel, she'd said one afternoon, I was hoping you could help me. Your father said you know the ranch better than anyone. Perhaps you could show me where the best berry patches are come summer? He just stared at her, his expression flat. The bears get most of them, he said, and walked away. The rejection was a physical blow. Winning this boy's trust seemed impossible, and without it, how could she ever hope to make a real home here? How could she protect him if he wouldn't even speak to her? The house itself seemed to be against her. It was Margaret's house, Her presence was everywhere. In the faded floral wallpaper of the master bedroom, a room Eleanor had only glimpsed through an open door, and in the tiny perfect stitches on a quilt draped over a chair in the sitting room. One evening, searching for extra blankets, Eleanor opened a chest at the foot of her bed in the housekeeper's room. She assumed it was for storage, but inside it wasn't blankets. It was filled with a woman's things, a silver-backed hairbrush with a few strands of auburn hair still tangled in the bristles, a book of poetry with a pressed flower marking a page, a small leather-bound journal. Her hands trembled as she picked up the journal. This was wrong, a violation of privacy, but she couldn't stop herself. This was a chance to understand the woman she was replacing, a chance to understand what she was walking into. She opened it. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. The first few pages were what she expected. Notes about the ranch, recipes, charming anecdotes about Daniel as a toddler. But then the tone began to change. Thomas is in another one of his moods. The silence is worse than the shouting. He looks at me, but he doesn't see me. He looks through me. I feel like a ghost in my own home. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She read on, her heart pounding. He watches me constantly. He questions where I've been, who I've spoken to. He says it's because he worries because the territory is a dangerous place. But it feels like possession. I am another one of his assets, like his land, his cattle, to be managed and controlled. Then she found the entry that made her stop breathing. I have to leave, for the boy's sake. Daniel is starting to notice. He flinches when his father enters a room. I cannot raise my sons in a house ruled by fear. I've written to my cousin in St. Louis. I'm saving what little money I can. When the spring thaw comes, we are going to disappear. The journal entry was dated just 2 weeks before the date the town said Margaret had died in childbirth. She hadn't been planning for a new baby. She'd been planning an escape. The day of the wedding arrived, gray and cold. Reverend Morrison looked like he was presiding over a funeral. His lips were a thin, disapproving line. A neighbor woman, a Mrs. Murphy, had been brought in as a witness. She had a kind, weathered face, but her eyes were full of pity when she looked at Eleanor. The ceremony was a blur. The words felt like lies in her mouth. Honor and cherish, in sickness and in health. Thomas's responses were clipped, his voice devoid of any emotion. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, there was a horribly awkward pause. Thomas leaned in and brushed his lips against hers. The kiss was cold, brief, and meaningless. It was the sealing of a contract. Samuel cheered. Daniel just watched, his face a perfect, unreadable mask. That night, Thomas made an announcement. Eleanor will no longer be staying in the housekeeper's room, he said, his voice carrying the weight of an order. She will take her rightful place in the master bedroom. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Separate rooms. That was the agreement. But we agreed, she whispered, her voice shaking. The agreement was for separate lives, he said, his eyes like chips of ice. It is not proper for my wife to sleep in the servants' quarters. You will have your privacy. My room is across the hall. He was talking about appearances, about what was proper, but it felt like a violation. He was forcing her into Margaret's room, Margaret's bed, the bed she had died in. He led her upstairs. He opened the door to the master bedroom. It was perfect. Too perfect. The bed was made with a beautiful blue and yellow quilt. A delicate writing desk sat by the window. It didn't look like a room that had been empty for 2 years. It looked like a room whose occupant had just stepped out for a moment. This was Margaret's room, he said, his voice carefully neutral. It felt like trespassing on sacred ground. I don't want to disturb anything, she said. The room needs to be lived in, he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. He left her there, alone, in a dead woman's room. She walked slowly to the wardrobe and opened it. Margaret's dresses still hung there, silks and fine wools, elegant and expensive. They smelled faintly of lavender. Beside them, her own worn, practical dresses would look like rags. She saw the silver-backed brush from the chest lying on the dressing table. He had put it there, for her. He wanted her to not just take Margaret's place, but to become her. She felt sick, trapped. This wasn't a marriage, it was an erasure. He was trying to erase his first wife by forcing Eleanor to step directly into her life, her clothes, her room. But the journal. The journal proved Margaret hadn't wanted this life. She had wanted to escape, and she had failed. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. Eleanor froze. She thought it was Thomas returning. She held her breath, listening. Silence. Then she heard it again. A soft, shuffling sound. Not the heavy tread of a man's boots. Something smaller. Lighter. It was coming from the end of the hall. From the nursery. The room Thomas had explicitly told the boys to stay out of. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable urge, Eleanor crept out of the bedroom and down the darkened hallway. The nursery door was slightly ajar. A thin sliver of moonlight cut through the gloom. She peered inside, and what she saw made her entire body go rigid with shock and fear. Daniel was sitting on the floor. In his hands, he clutched a small, worn wooden horse. But that wasn't what shocked her. In front of him, facing the wall, was a large portrait. As she watched, the boy slowly, carefully turned it around. It was a painting of Margaret, beautiful and smiling, with a baby Samuel on her lap and a younger Daniel standing proudly beside her. And that still wasn't the most shocking part. Drawn across Margaret's smiling face, scratched violently into the canvas itself, were jagged, angry lines. Her portrait had been defaced, mutilated, and sitting beside Daniel, holding the small knife that had clearly done the damage, was Thomas. He wasn't looking at the portrait. He was looking at his son, and on his face was an expression of cold, silent approval. Eleanor's mind reeled. The journal, the fear in Daniel's eyes, the defaced portrait. It wasn't Thomas the boy was afraid of. He was a participant. They were in this together. This wasn't just a house of grief. It was a house of rage. A rage directed at the dead woman who had tried to leave them. And Eleanor had just been locked inside with them. She backed away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it would break. She had to get out. She had to escape, just as Margaret had tried to. But the roads were still a sea of mud and melting snow. The nearest town was miles away, and she had no money, no horse, no one. She was more trapped now than she had been in the blizzard. She stumbled back to her new room, to Margaret's room, and leaned against the door, gasping for breath. Her eyes darted around the room, seeing it now not as a shrine, but as a cage, a beautifully decorated cage. Her gaze fell on the writing desk by the window. Margaret's desk, where she had sat and planned her escape. Eleanor walked to it, her movements stiff, robotic. She ran her hand along its smooth, polished surface. Her fingers brushed against something on the underside, a small, loose piece of wood. Curious, she felt around it. It was a latch, a tiny, hidden latch. With trembling fingers, she found the catch and pressed it. A section of the desk's ornate trim popped open, revealing a hidden compartment. It was barely big enough for a few folded papers. Inside was a small stack of letters, tied with a ribbon, and a single folded piece of paper, a ticket, a stagecoach ticket to St. Louis. One way, dated the day after she had supposedly died in childbirth. The letters were from her cousin, filled with words of encouragement. "Be brave, my dear Margaret. Your new life awaits you here. We will protect you and the boys. He will never find you." Margaret hadn't died, not in childbirth anyway. She had been ready to leave. She had her ticket. She had her plan. So what had happened? What had stopped her? The answer, Eleanor suspected, lay with the man sleeping just across the hall. The man who was now her husband. The first weeks of her marriage were a masterclass in survival. Eleanor played her part perfectly. She was the dutiful wife, the caring stepmother. She cooked, she cleaned, she started her lessons with Samuel and a few of the ranch hands' children who were eager to learn. She never let the mask of calm slip, not for a moment. But underneath, she was a bundle of raw nerves, watching, listening, searching for a way out. She treated Thomas with a careful, deferential respect that seemed to please him. She learned his routines. He was up before dawn, out on the range all day, and back after dusk, usually too tired for anything more than a short, stilted dinner conversation. He seemed content with the arrangement. His house was running smoothly. His boys were cared for. He had his new, compliant wife. But the nights were torture. Lying in Margaret's bed, Eleanor would stare into the darkness, the secrets of the house pressing in on her. She would hear the floorboards creak as Thomas moved around in his room across the hall. Sometimes she would hear voices, his voice low and angry, and Daniel's small and fearful. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough to make her skin crawl. He was conditioning the boy, poisoning his mind against his own mother, turning her memory into something monstrous. Her only hope was Daniel. If she could somehow win his trust, maybe she could learn the truth. Maybe they could help each other. But he remained a fortress, just like his father. He did his lessons, he answered her questions politely, but he never offered a single word more than necessary. His eyes, however, told a different story. They followed her everywhere. She felt like a specimen under a microscope. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the cattle. Thomas started losing them. A few at first, then a dozen, then 20. The fences were being cut. The tracks showed the cattle were being driven, not just wandering off. Rustlers. It was a common enough problem, but the timing was suspicious. "It's Henderson," Thomas said one evening, slamming his fist on the kitchen table. Samuel jumped, and even Daniel flinched. "He's been trying to buy my north pasture for years. Says the railroad is planning to survey there. He's trying to squeeze me, ruin me." The rustling escalated. It was bold, aggressive. They weren't just stealing cattle, they were sending a message. One of Thomas's prize bulls was found dead, shot and left to rot. A few days later, one of the ranch hands, a young man named Jake, was shot in the shoulder. He'd stumbled upon the rustlers in the act. The ranch became an armed camp. Men patrolled the perimeter day and night. The tension was a thick, suffocating blanket. And through it all, Eleanor played her part, tending to the wounded ranch hand, making sure the men were fed, keeping the boys calm. Thomas watched her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something new in his eyes. Respect. He saw her competence, her steadiness under pressure. He was starting to see her as more than just a housekeeper. He was starting to see her as an asset. This, she realized, was her chance, her opportunity. She found him in the study late one night, poring over maps of the ranch. "Thomas," she said, her voice soft, "I'm worried." He looked up, surprised. She rarely disturbed him in his study. "We're handling it," he said gruffly. "I know," she said, stepping closer. "But the boys. Daniel hasn't been sleeping. He has nightmares." This was a lie, but a necessary one. He cries out in his sleep. He calls for his mother. Thomas's face hardened. "He'll get over it." "Will he?" she pressed, pushing her luck. "Or will the memory of her haunt this house forever?" Perhaps. Perhaps if he understood what happened. If you talked to him about her. "There's nothing to talk about," Thomas snapped. "She got sick. She died. The end." "But did she?" The words were out before Eleanor could stop them. They hung in the air between them, shimmering with danger. His eyes narrowed to slits. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice a low, deadly whisper. Her heart was pounding, but she held her ground. "The town," she said, improvising frantically. "People whisper. They say she wasn't sick. They say she was unhappy, that she wanted to leave." The silence in the room was absolute. He stared at her, his face a mask of stone, but she could see the fury building in his eyes. He was going to call her a liar. He was going to throw her out, or worse. But then his expression changed. The fury was replaced by something else, a slow, calculating look. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "And what if she was?" he said, his voice dangerously soft. "What if she was going to abandon her children? Abandon her husband? What kind of woman does that, Eleanor? Would you call that a good mother?" He was testing her. He was pulling her into his twisted version of reality. She had to give the right answer. "No," she said, her voice barely audible. "That would be a betrayal." A slow, cold smile spread across his face. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. "Exactly," he said. "A betrayal. And betrayals have consequences." He stood up and walked toward her. She forced herself not to flinch as he reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was cold as a snake. "You're not like her, are you, Eleanor?" he whispered. "You're smart. You're a survivor. You understand loyalty." She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. "Good," he said, turning back to his desk. "I'm glad we understand each other." She backed out of the room, her legs unsteady. She had passed his test. She had gained a small measure of his trust. But she had also confirmed her worst fears. He had as good as confessed. He had discovered Margaret's plan to leave, and he had stopped her. He had killed her, and their son, their 7-year-old son, knew. He was a witness, or worse, an accomplice. The rustlers' attacks grew bolder. They weren't just hitting the remote pastures anymore. One night, a fire broke out in the main barn. It was put out quickly, but the message was clear. "We can get to you. We can touch the heart of your home." Eleanor saw the fear taking root in Thomas, not for his own life, but for his ranch, his legacy. This land was everything to him, his obsession, the thing he had killed to protect. The pressure was making him erratic, his temper shorter than ever. The boys felt it. Samuel became clingy and tearful. Daniel just got quieter, his eyes like old haunted stones. Eleanor knew she was running out of time. The fragile trust she had built with Thomas could shatter at any moment. She had to find a way to get Daniel to talk to her. Alone. Her opportunity came during a supply run to town. It was the first time she'd been off the ranch since her wedding. Thomas needed to speak with the sheriff about the rustling, and he had to leave the boys with her at the general store. It was risky. He would only be gone for an hour, maybe less. As soon as he was gone, she turned to the children. "Samuel," she said, her voice bright and cheerful, "Mrs. Miller has a new barrel of rock candy. Why don't you see if she'll give you a piece?" Samuel's eyes lit up and he scampered off. Now it was just her and Daniel. He stood by the window watching the street, his small shoulders tense. "Daniel," she said, her voice low and urgent, "we need to talk." He didn't turn around. "About what?" "About your mother." He stiffened. "Papa says we're not to talk about her." "I know what he says," she whispered, moving closer. "But I need to know the truth. I found her journal, Daniel. I found the ticket. I know she was leaving." He whipped around, his face pale, his eyes wide with panic. "You shouldn't have seen that. You have to hide it. If he finds out—" "If he finds out what?" She pressed gently. "Daniel, what happened that day? The day she was supposed to leave?" Tears welled in his eyes. He shook his head, clamping his mouth shut. "She wasn't leaving you," Eleanor said, a desperate gamble. "She was taking you with her. She was trying to protect you. From him." A single tear rolled down his cheek. He looked out the window at the sheriff's office across the street. "He was so angry," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "He found the ticket. They were shouting. She was crying. She told him he was a monster, that he only cared about the land." "And then what happened?" Eleanor prompted, her heart aching for this child. He locked her in the bedroom. He told me she was a bad woman, a traitor. He said she was trying to steal us away from him. He said we had to punish her." The boy was shaking now, his words coming in broken sobs. "He gave me the knife from his hunting belt. He told me to make her ugly, so no one else would ever want her." Eleanor felt the bile rise in her throat. It was worse than she could have ever imagined. He had forced his own child to mutilate the portrait of his mother as some kind of sick, twisted lesson in loyalty. "But the fire," Daniel whispered, his eyes wide with a deeper terror. "I didn't mean to, I swear." "What fire, Daniel?" Eleanor asked, her blood running cold. "What are you talking about?" "She was locked in the room," he choked out. "I heard her crying. I felt bad. I just wanted to talk to her. I took a lantern. The door was locked, so I was talking through the keyhole. And then I heard the horses, Mr. Henderson and his men. They were at the front door shouting for Papa. Papa got spooked. He came running up the stairs. He grabbed me. He knocked the lantern. It fell. The curtains. They went up so fast." Eleanor stared at him, the horrifying truth crashing down on her. Margaret hadn't died in childbirth. Thomas hadn't murdered her in cold blood. It was an accident. A horrible, tragic accident born from cruelty and fear. She hadn't burned to death. The town doctor, likely paid or threatened by Thomas, had reported she died from complications of childbirth. The fire, which must have been small and contained to the room, was covered up completely. Thomas had let the whole world believe a lie. He had let his own son believe he was responsible for his mother's death. This secret was the poison that had infected this house. It was the reason for Thomas's paranoia, for Daniel's haunted silence. He wasn't protecting his father. He was carrying the guilt of a crime he didn't commit. "Daniel," she said, gripping his shoulders, "listen to me. It was not your fault. Do you hear me? It was an accident. Your father knocked the lantern, not you." But before the boy could respond, the bell on the store's door jangled. Thomas was back. His eyes immediately darted between Eleanor's face and his son's tear-streaked cheeks. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Nothing," Eleanor said quickly. "Daniel was just worried about the rustlers." Thomas's gaze lingered on her for a moment too long. He didn't believe her. He knew she was getting too close. The ride back to the ranch was thick with a terrifying, unspoken tension. Eleanor's mind was racing. She knew the truth now. But what could she do? The word of a penniless teacher against the most powerful man in the county? And she had Daniel to think about, if Thomas even suspected the boy had talked. That night, the rustlers attacked the ranch itself. It wasn't a raid. It was an assault. Gunshots echoed through the night. Men were shouting. It was chaos. Thomas and his hands were in a full-blown firefight near the barn. "Take the boys to the root cellar," Thomas yelled at Eleanor, pressing a shotgun into her hands. "Don't come out until I get you." She herded the terrified boys into the pantry, but as she was lifting the heavy trapdoor, she heard the sound of the front door splintering. They were in the house. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency, "get Samuel to the back of the cellar. Hide, and do not make a sound." She closed the trapdoor over them, slid a sack of flour on top of it, and turned to face the hallway, the shotgun feeling heavy and alien in her hands. Two men burst in. They froze when they saw her. "Well, looky here," one of them sneered. "The new Mrs. Caldwell." "Get out of my house," she said, surprised by how steady her voice was. The man laughed and took a step toward her. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She fired. The blast was deafening. The man screamed and went down, clutching a leg shredded by buckshot. His partner raised his pistol, but before he could fire, a new voice echoed from the front door. "Drop it, now." It was the sheriff, and behind him were four armed deputies. The remaining intruder dropped his gun, his hands shooting into the air. The firefight outside died down. It was over. The sheriff, a man named Brady, helped her tie up the intruders. "Got your wire, Caldwell," he said, nodding to Thomas as he came inside. "Looks like we got here just in time." He looked at the man Eleanor had shot, Henderson's top foreman. "Looks like you were right about him." But then the sheriff's eyes fell on something else, on the second man, the one who had surrendered. Eleanor hadn't recognized him in the dim light. But now, she had seen him before, in town, talking to Thomas. He wasn't a rustler. He was one of Thomas's own ranch hands, a man named Miguel. Thomas saw her looking. He saw the recognition, the dawning horror on her face, and in that instant, she understood everything. The rustling, the attacks, the dead bull, the wounded man, the fire. It was all a lie, a performance, a brilliantly staged drama designed for one purpose: to isolate the ranch, to keep people away, to justify turning it into a fortress. Why? To keep his secret buried, to keep his son, the only witness to his mother's accidental death, under his absolute control. Miguel wasn't a traitor. He was an actor, playing a part in his boss's paranoid fantasy. "It was all you," she whispered, her voice trembling with the force of her realization. "There were no rustlers. It was always you." Thomas's face was a mask of cold fury. The sheriff looked back and forth between them, confused. "What's she talking about, Caldwell?" But Thomas wasn't looking at the sheriff. He was looking at Eleanor. "You should have stayed out of it," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You should have been a good, quiet wife." He lunged for her, but he wasn't fast enough. The sheriff and his deputies were on him in an instant, wrestling him to the ground. It was over. The lies, the secrets, the reign of fear, it was all over. In the aftermath, the full story came out. Miguel, granted immunity, confessed everything. He told them how Thomas, consumed by paranoia after Margaret's death, had concocted the entire rustling scheme. He'd used it to justify his isolation, to control his men, and most importantly, to control his son. The most damning testimony came from Daniel. In the safety of the sheriff's office, with Eleanor by his side, the little boy finally told the truth. Not just about the fire, but about the years of his father's cruelty, the psychological torment, the way he'd twisted Daniel's grief into guilt. He told them about the defaced portrait, the locked doors, the constant threats. Thomas Caldwell, the most powerful man in 3 counties, was ruined. He was charged with false imprisonment, endangerment of a child, and a dozen other crimes. The land he had killed to protect would be sold off to pay his debts. He had lost everything. Eleanor was left with the boys. The town, which had once whispered about her, now hailed her as a hero. They saw the truth. She hadn't been a gold digger. She'd been a prisoner, just like the children. With the help of Mrs. Murphy and a surprisingly repentant town, she began to build a new life. She used Margaret's secret stash of money, the money for the escape ticket, to buy a small house in town. She opened her school, and it quickly filled with students. Daniel and Samuel began to heal. Without their father's dark shadow hanging over them, they started to act like children again. Samuel's laughter was louder, and Daniel's haunted eyes slowly began to lose their fear. He still had nightmares, but now he would come to Eleanor, and she would hold him until they passed. One evening, months later, Eleanor was putting the boys to bed. Daniel was looking at an old photograph of his mother, the one from the portrait, which Eleanor had had restored. "She was beautiful," Daniel said quietly. "Yes, she was," Eleanor agreed, "and she was very brave. She would be so proud of you, Daniel, for telling the truth." "Are you going to be our mama now?" Samuel asked from his bed. "For real this time?" Eleanor looked at their hopeful faces. She hadn't come to Montana looking for a family. She had been looking for survival, but somehow, in the midst of all the darkness and fear, she had found one. A broken one, yes, but one she was determined to make whole. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For real this time." It wasn't the life she had ever imagined for herself, but as she tucked the blankets around the 2 little boys who had been through hell and back, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that it was the life she was meant to have. The wind still howled across the Montana plains, but for the first time in a very long time, the house was quiet. The ghosts were gone. And the future, once a terrifying unknown blizzard, now looked as bright and clear as a spring morning. If you were moved by Eleanor's story of courage and survival, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments below, what do you think was the bravest thing she did? Thanks for watching.